Hey there, welcome to School of Emo, the podcast where we dive into the world of emo, pop punk, and everything in between. If you've ever found yourself in your car screaming the lyrics to Taking Back Sunday, wearing way too much eyeliner in the early 2000s, adding a buckle or a chain to every outfit you've put on, you are in the right place. I'm Erin Judge, and each week I will be your fellow student, guiding you through the music, the culture, and the history that shaped an entire generation of angsty teens. I am not the teacher of this school. I am a fellow student, here to learn alongside you and from you. Together, we will cover a lot of information that doesn't really matter, but will remind us of the days of stalking MySpace channels and getting lost in chat rooms. So connect your dial-up, turn on your webcam, and let's go to School of Emo. Today, we are going to do our first artist deep dive. And because I've recently seen The Used for the first few times in the past 6 months and spent a lot of time with them on the Emo's Not Dead cruise, we are going to dive deep into The Used. And I'm really excited because I did a lot of digging into past interviews, current interviews, some of the history of the band. And if you can remember from episode 1, my personal story with this emo world and my love of emo music was never deep in chat rooms. I was not always familiar with all the lore. I never got to go to Warped Tour growing up, none of those things. And so all of this is kind of new to me and part of little things I've heard people talk about, but I feel like I'm kind of experiencing it all for the first time. So I'm excited to share with you guys the things that I've learned in my research and excited to hear what you would add to it or change or your opinions on it, which you can share on socials or email me or comment if you're on YouTube. So hopefully I'll see you there. The Used is one of those bands that I would say was at the forefront of this kind of post-hardcore, kind of new core rock era that really transitioned into what we consider to be emo today. I believe at the beginning of their career, they did not necessarily consider themselves an emo band. They fought the title of emo bands. I think at that time as a whole, emo was a really tricky descriptor because all music is emotional. So how do you define that? But now they are what we would consider to be such a clear-cut emo band, and they even acknowledge that. If you hear Burt McCracken, the lead singer now, speak in interviews, he will acknowledge that they are fully an emo band. And some people would consider them to be some of the founders and leaders of what we consider to be emo today. And they've been around for 25 years. They have been around to see the evolution of the genre, see the evolution of music in this space. And it hasn't necessarily been a pretty ride, even though they have been there, present, and together for the entire time. So today we are going to dive into the ups, the downs, the myths, the interviews, all of the things surrounding the Used and what made them who they are today. So the origin story of the Used was back in Utah, which I find fascinating. Again, all of this is new to me, and digging deeper into Burt's childhood and what influenced a lot of the music that they produced. Knowing that it came out of Utah is very interesting. But they were formed in 2001. So again, going on now about 25, they're in their 25th year. And the original band members didn't include Burt. We're going to talk about Burt a lot just because the front man tends to be the one that does a lot of the interviews, tends to be the one that is the chaos that tends to lead to all the stories. He's more involved in writing a lot of the music. So he is what we kind of think of when we think of the Used. But originally he was not actually in the band, and he was close enough to what we would consider to be a founding member, but he wasn't the core start. But the core members at the beginning were Quinn Allman, Jeff Howard, and Brandon Steinekert. Steinekert? However you say his last name. And they were a typical kind of garage band in the 2000s, but didn't have that front man. And so they were searching for the front man, the vocalist for their band to make it complete. And that is when Burt came on the scene. Now, Burt actually grew up doing theater. So Burt had already been diving into music, had been making music. He had some bands. I believe he said one of his first bands was called Cobra Kai, but he was part of different bands, ska band. He had gotten kicked out of the bands that he was a part of, but he had already had some experience. And then he joined into the Used and has been there ever since. So since that point, he kind of has been one of the steady, stable members throughout the history of the Used, which I think is why he tends to be associated with the band most frequently. And his backstory really created the vibe, the culture, kind of the identity of the band. I couldn't find as much information on the other members and some of their background, which I find really interesting. Again, I think we get more interviews from the frontmen, so a lot is kind of leaning on Bert. But Bert grew up in Utah in a Mormon family, and he grew up in a household like many that was centered around a certain religion that had a lot of rules and kind of community guidelines, if you will. And so he grew up in a very strict home. He talks about how whenever he was very early in his age, he was in his, I think he said around like 10 years old or early teens, he was first introduced to Michael Jackson. And that was one of his biggest moments of, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be in a band, I'm going to perform. And he always knew that from the beginning, which is why he leaned into theater in his teen years. Now, because he grew up in such a strict household, he talked about how, he would get access to music, but was constantly restricted from being able to listen to it and learn from it and experiment with it, which led to this strong divide between himself and his parents and what they wanted for him, and the kind of box that they wanted him to fit in. And if we know Bert now or his history, he is a force. He is a wild card, especially on stage. And so that rebellion kicked in, and he actually left home and became homeless. So he lived with friends, he lived in basements, couches, but he left home in his teens. And that's when he started to become part of these different bands. He talked about how he was actually straight edge, and he didn't do drugs, didn't drink a lot of alcohol. Like during those early years after he left home, that was actually not part of his life and not the reason he left, according to himself in interviews. But whenever he was on his own, he was in a vulnerable space, and there was some hopelessness included in that, a loss of identity and security a little bit, in trying to fit in with these different band members before the Used. That's whenever his addiction with drug and alcohol use really began. And that has followed him throughout his life. And we'll keep diving into that more through this episode because it does kind of lean into some of the history of the band, as well as influence a lot of the music that we belt out in our cars every single week, if not every single day. And so it's really important to understand the band as a whole and their sound. But whenever he joined the Used, that was actually the first kind of community he was a part of after he had been already using drugs, alcohol, like deep into alcohol addiction. They were the ones that started taking him to NA meetings. They were the ones that they were so sober, like they were encouraging him to like obtain sobriety and get control over those addictions that used to kind of pull him out of that place, which I think is really beautiful. And I guess kind of maybe is that foundation that has led to especially him being present and active and still doing all of this as the Used today. Maybe that's why they never officially fully broke up or took a break or stopped producing music and touring, because that was such a family kind of dynamic at that time, whenever family was something that was missing. So Bert joined the band and they released their first self-titled debut album in 2002, which quickly blew up, exploded, became a hit, and became something that is timeless, to the point that Taste of Ink, I'm sure, is on your daily rotation if you're listening to this podcast. It's a song that still remains at the top of their streaming performance of all time. They play it at every show. And it was there from the very beginning with this core group of founding members of the band. They actually reached gold status in 2003, a year after the album was released. And then they hit platinum status in 2019, which is interesting. Again, there's so much that lasts with time, which is really cool and really beautiful. So the debut album, self-titled, that includes songs like Taste of Ink, Bury Myself Alive, Blue and Yellow, very instant hits. Again, at the core of what we consider emo, will be on every playlist for emo night. This was everywhere, quickly saturated the spaces of MTV, Warped Tour, all of these spaces where alt rock, post-hardcore, emo pop punk would be found. So where did these songs come from? The band was formed in 2001. This was released in 2002. So quickly came together with Bert coming in, helping write it. What influenced it? So after Bert got out of rehab, so remember, he joined the band kind of supported him, took him to meetings, encouraged rehab. So he got out of rehab. He was living in Quinn Allman's basement, who was the guitarist at the time. And Bert decided at that time that he was ready to get out of Utah. The band had been formed. They had something special. They were connected. It's time to put music out. And this is our shot. Let's give it everything we have. We're getting out of Utah. It's time to move on and move forward, which was psychic because they did just that. So they wrote the music in the basement, and it came out of that backstory of Bert that we know, right? Living in a household where he could fully be himself, express himself. He was under a lot of rules and restrictions, disconnected then from his home, from his family, going into places of not being good enough. He mentioned being kicked out of one band because he wasn't hardcore enough. And then he got kicked out of another band because he was too hardcore and too wild. And then he wasn't doing drugs, wasn't drinking alcohol, but then with trying to gain acceptance, now fell into a place of addiction and had to go through recovery and seek that in his young years. So Taste of Ink was a song and an anthem that really came out of that heartbreak, that darkness, that part of his life, which is, I believe, why it is so timeless. And when we think about the Used, their music and their history over time, their songs hit so deeply because they have come out of these personal experiences. And Bert, especially, has always been really honest, open, vulnerable, listening to old interviews versus interviews even just a couple of months ago. He seems to really allow himself to open up. And we hear that in the music. We see that in the music. We see that in the performances. And while, yes, it may be messy, there may be some chaos that has been included in all of that, it is real. It's honest. It's vulnerable. And that's why so many of us connect with it and maybe even can process and just experience, I don't know, our own level of recovery or whatever we need from singing it at the top of our lungs, which is what makes music so incredibly powerful, especially emo music, but any music truly. So we have that first album, 2002, self-titled The Used. In 2003, they produced a smaller album that's a little bit less, I guess, played, called Maybe Memories. And then in 2004, we get the iconic In Love and Death album, which I hate to say is my favorite because I probably need to give myself more time to fully embrace all of the albums. And I wasn't fully in it when these were released. And so I miss out on experiencing them in their prime. But In Love and Death is so iconic. I Caught Fire. All That I've Got is my all-time favorite, the Used song. I'm a Fake, such a good one. And then the Under Pressure cover, that was the collaboration between Gerard Way and My Chemical Romance with Burt McCracken and the Used, which is iconic in history because of the relationship between Burt and Gerard that we will get into later. So we have that album in 2004. We're in the throes of Warped Tour. The Used has risen to the forefront. They are headlining shows, they are touring, they are selling out, they are selling records, they are a favorite among so many people. They have a fandom that is connected to their music. And then in 2006, the first major lineup change for the band happened. So they will say, and he said this even on the cruise, Bert said this, it's been said in many of their shows since when we were young, at all three shows, they said this on the cruise, is that they've been together for 25 years. They've never broken up. They never took a break. They've been right here doing this. That doesn't mean the same members have been present. There have been some changes in the band members aside from Bert. So in 2006, the drummer Brandon Steinekert actually quit, and the reason was personality conflicts. There was a lot of chaos at this time, which we will get into. So maybe because of that, who knows? But then he was replaced by Dan Whitesides. And then over the next few years, there were more albums that they produced. So with that drummer, they produced the 2007 Lies for the Liars, another iconic album. They produced Artwork in 2009. And then in 2015, guitarist Quinn Allman took a break from the band and then eventually completely separated from the band and was replaced by Justin Schikowsky, who at that time was part of Seosin. So he left Seosin, came to the Used. Now, with Allman leaving, this was one of the major kind of chaotic, controversial issues in the band, where the band was in headlines and there was a lot of drama surrounding how the band was functioning and the members of the band. So this controversy around Allman leaving has kind of followed the band throughout history, and was pretty messy. So whenever he left, he filed a lawsuit against the band and specifically targeted Bert McCracken, the lead, and alleged that he was owed significant touring, album, and merchandise proceeds following the dismissal from the band, and claimed that there were issues with late and irregular royalty payments. And so really more about kind of financial disputes. And a lot of bands around that time seem to have a lot of drama in this space, which, you know, my husband worked for the music industry for a long time, or a handful of years, because we are here in Nashville. I will say he worked on the finance side. He worked in artist management. He worked for a record label. Finances in the music industry can get really messy really quick. And oftentimes there's so many complexities to where money is coming from, where it is going, who's controlling it, what contracts say, poor contracts that are put into place. And people tend to get screwed over, whether that be intentional or not intentional. In this case, we all will never fully know. There are people out there who probably know the full perfect truth, but the full perfect truth may not exist. However, this was settled in court in 2020. So he left in 2015, lawsuit started, and was finally settled in 2020, which is a long time. And I believe there are still some kind of controversies surrounding this whole situation with the more recent tour that was announced in 2024. There were a lot of comments and people talking about maybe more controversies around Quinn's experience in the band and, you know, allegations that were thrown out. They were not kind of followed up on or solidified. Maybe that's something that we will learn more about in coming years. But this was clearly not clean cut of a departure. This was messy and hopefully has led to some healing, recovery, and retribution, whatever that looks like. But probably continues to be messy to this day. All right, so then in 2018, Schikowsky was dismissed from the band. Again, internal conflicts were noted, and then was replaced by Joey Bradford as the new guitarist. So a few extra changes there. And then came their 2020 album called Heartwork, which then was followed by a more deluxe edition in 2021, likely kind of re-released because of the COVID pandemic and that interfering with a true release of this album, Heartwork. Now, there were some other albums kind of throughout this time that just haven't maintained to be so like iconic compared to some of the ones that we're most familiar with. But we have After Artwork 2009, we have Vulnerable in 2012, we have The Ocean of the Sky in 2013, Imaginary Enemy in 2014. They had a live and acoustic album in 2016, The Canyon in 2017. Then we have Heartwork in 2020. Bert will say that he thinks this is their best album and most underrated because it never really got the release it deserved and maybe even the attention it deserved. It didn't really get to be toured fully. And then in 2023, they released Toxic Positivity, which is an album I personally have loved. A little bit more of a pop influence in that album, which is really fun. And hopefully we'll see. I know right now they're touring their top 3 albums, self-titled In Love and Death and Lies for the Liars. They're on tour one night each at a city. So full albums all the way through. And then we have Meds from 2024. Which is also pretty incredible. And there's some iconic songs already there, a little bit of a shorter album, but we can't say that The Used as a band is being lazy. They are putting out music almost every single year. They remain kind of faithful, dedicated to the art, which Bert has talked about often as being kind of healing and part of his own recovery when it comes to his own sobriety, but also kind of a therapy in the way that he addresses his mental health. So clearly, the band uses their creativity, they're connected to their fans through their art, and it is meaningful to them, or they wouldn't continue putting it out. Every album has not been a huge success, but The Used as a whole remains a huge success and continues giving their fans stuff to enjoy, which is rare among bands that have been around for this long and in this space. So now let's get into some of the controversy and the chaos outside of Allman leaving the band and the kind of disputes that came out of that. A lot of the chaos over time has centered around and been connected to Bert. Fun fact, in a recent interview, Bert actually said that he does not go by Bert with his family. He goes by Robbie. Bert is his frontman persona. The early stages of The Used, whenever they rose to fame quickly, remember, he was early in his sobriety. He came out of a place where there was not a lot of security in his identity, his foundation, like what was going on in his life, like his background, going from that into a bit of sobriety, like a little moment of that, and then being pushed into the spotlight, touring nonstop, putting out music, having insane fandom that he didn't have before, being a performer and putting together this persona that would adapt to what a crowd needed from him and would kind of give him what he needed, feed him energetically. You can see, in hindsight and as a mature adult, where chaos could easily ensue. And that definitely happened because Bert, in the early days of Warped Tour, he just built this reputation for himself of being a complete wild card. He would give everything he had in a performance, and he seemed to really crave the shock, the awe. He's said in recent interviews that the thing that he knows that he would seek, and even today still continues to seek, is fear. He wants people to be fearful of him, unsure of what he'll do, kind of being that unexpected, like, I don't know what I'm going to get from you, and that kind of uneasiness that you see in some of the biggest artists of all time, like Prince or Michael Jackson. That's what he wanted, even more than admiration. And I think you can see that when you look at some of the history or old performances, or even see him perform today, is he's not necessarily wanting the crowd to feel good and happy. He wants them to be shocked. He wants them to maybe feel a little uneasy, which does kind of link and blend really well with the music and the lyrics themselves. But during the early days of Warped Tour, Bert would consistently, most shows, throw up, vomit, because of him giving everything he had. There were a lot of rumors that he was on drugs, that he was drunk at all the shows. He says today that that wasn't always the case, but he would literally put out so much energy and push his body to the extreme where he would just puke during a show, and it would be this kind of game with his audience of like, when is it going to happen? And became just what he was known for. He also had a lot of maybe mystery, and there were a lot of headlines and ongoing drama that was birthed out of his friendship with Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance. Now, he says that the early days of My Chemical Romance, that the Used would actually pull them in and bring them on tour, but it was a very quick connection. He and Gerard maybe shared some similarities in their creativity, in the way that they embraced life, the type of roles that they played as frontmen in these bands that were, pushing the edge, pushing the limits as much as possible. So he and Gerard became very fast friends. And there were a lot of rumors about what was truly going on within this relationship. So they were close, they partied together. Some people think that they had some sort of secret relationship, whether it was like physical, possibly sexual, maybe more than that. They always said that they were just friends, but they would kind of play into some of these rumors, never giving straight answers. I watched an interview that they did together in 2010, and they were answering fan questions, and they were goofy, silly, maybe on something, who knows? But they didn't necessarily like take things seriously. And I think they enjoyed the attention of, what could be happening behind the scenes. They really leaned into that, which left a lot to the imagination of fans on both sides of, whether you're on the Used side, the My Chemical Romance side, or somewhere kind of in the combination between. There's a belief that the song Pretty Handsome Awkward is believed to be about Gerard. Some fans will say that that is 100% confirmed, that that is who it is about. And you'll see influences, collaborations with My Chemical Romance, kind of influences of the band in each band. Like they influence each other. They did a lot together. They toured together. They spent a lot of time together. You would see them together. They had a very close bond, close relationship between the front man, but also the band as a whole. So there came a point in their relationship where there was a divide, and it is still mysterious. There are still questions on how real the feud and the divide actually was, what was made up, what was played into, what was dramatized. Neither of the band members were necessarily fully honest all the time, or they liked, I think, the mystery of it, and also wanting people out of their personal life and their personal business. So there's a lot that we still don't know, and only they know. But there was a divide, there was a feud that started that kind of split these bands apart from one another and divided many fans in, both sections. And the theory is that Gerard decided to get sober, to stop partying, and Bert was not ready for that yet. And so the belief was that Bert got offended, he got hurt, and that he turned on Gerard in My Chemical Romance, causing a feud that some fans will say are one-sided. There is also some belief that it's one-sided in the other direction. And you'll listen to interviews from Bert as early as last year who will say that. So there's still a lot we don't necessarily know, but we do know that there was a divide. There was a lot of drama, and the Used, Bert, would make statements derogatory and down on My Chemical Romance and vice versa. And that friendship seemingly ended. In 2020, the Used and Bert, they canceled a couple of shows, and he alluded to the fact that they were going to tour with My Chemical Romance. So there's this kind of ongoing theory that they will eventually tour together. And then COVID hit, tours changed, and we don't ever know. I think Bert now says that he was just joking, but were there conversations? He mentioned that he had been like texting Gerard at that time. Are they actually like a mended friendship? Are they going to tour together? Was that only one-sided? Was Bert simply just trying to put it into the universe because he wants that to happen? What would that be like? Very interesting. I would love to just get an eye on those texts or be a fly on the wall during that conversation. Like, is there maybe an actual feud that's still going on, or has it been fully repaired and fans are just kind of playing along and they're laughing behind our backs? I don't know. My Chemical Romance is going on tour this year, and the Used is not an opener. So maybe one day. Now, Bert talks today about some of his chaos and his tendencies over time. And he mentions that he is a little erratic at times. And throughout his time with addiction, which was deep in this period of time, and also outside of that, and just the world and his persona on stage and the creativity and the music and just who he is as a person, his history has led to him burning a lot of bridges, and some of them have been repaired and mended, some have not. He is fully aware of that and even takes responsibility for that, but also kind of has a mentality of like, well, that's just kind of the way it is, which, maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. That's for him and his family to decide. But during this time, this feud was going on. And it was also the time where Bert lost his girlfriend at the time, named Kate, who died from a drug overdose while pregnant with his child. So lost both her, lost the child. He also has communicated in other interviews that he lost his dog during this time. And so it felt like immense grief kind of piled on everything else. And this is what really birthed and kind of influenced the In Love and Death album. So the Used self-titled album was influenced by this period of time of kind of the identity being stripped away, losing family in a way, homelessness, the starts of addiction, feeding into the Used, crazy partying, fandom, this feud starting. We have immense loss, some of the greatest loss that he had experienced up until this point. And then that fed into In Love and Death. And he credits his ability to kind of work through this grief and even allow himself to be creative and work out his grief through the album itself, through the lyrics, through the performance of it, the release of it, because of their producer, John Feldman. He communicated, through interviews that John was the one who kind of helped pick him up and bring him back. So the first kind of crux of his life, he had his band members that were doing that for him and with him. And now he has his producer, which we can all thank for the In Love and Death album and probably the ongoing history of the Used. So those early days of addiction, like during all of this time, Bert really struggled. There was hospitalizations, there were arrests that happened multiple times. And it was really linked to his alcohol intake and painted a little bit of like the relationships and the reputation of the band. They developed a reputation really early on as kind of being not only wild cards and maybe not the most reliable, but being, partiers and pushing the limits to the point where it could be dangerous. And so his band members at that point kind of decided that he either fixed this or they were no longer doing it. So this was a point where there could have been, we have In Love and Death, but there could have been a split, or the Used could have been dead. And so at that point, Bert went to rehab and actually got sober from alcohol and has remained sober, in his words, ever since. And he communicates the sobriety being around alcohol primarily. Drugs have still had a place in his life, whether that be weed that he has said that he does use. He said in more recent interviews he stopped using it, but then still uses it. And then other drugs from time and time. He is very open and honest about where they fit in his life. But he does say that when it came to alcohol, that he would drink to death. That was the goal. He doesn't have any control over it. And it is, for him, a device of dying. And so not something that has been helpful, not something that he will continue to use. And so he has maintained that sobriety. And the other drugs, weed, some of those substances, he says have helped him maintain his sobriety from alcohol. Now, have they had this kind of perfect cleanup of their reputation and, no chaos since then? Not necessarily, but the chaos and as much of the drama definitely have settled over time, with him maintaining his sobriety and the band just growing and maturing over time. Now, Bert is married. He got married prior to sobriety. His wife is also kind of part of that, threatened to kind of leave. And, that was definitely a strain on their relationship. But he has been married, I believe, since 2000, maybe 10. That is not fully confirmed, but he has been married for a while. He has two daughters now. He lives in Sydney with his wife. He lived in LA for a while, but then moved to Sydney because his wife is Australian. And they have been together. She helped him through his sobriety. He says that, being a dad has been also a really healing part of his recovery over time and has kind of given him a different version of his life and maybe helped with kind of calming down this side of him that we see in the early years of the Used. But the chaos in the music and the drama on stage, the force that is Bert McCracken as the front man of the Used is still there. He is still a little uneasy to be around. He is still considered to be a bit of a wild card. You don't know what you're going to get. You don't fully know what you're going to say. And a lot of people have opinions about him as a whole and what they think about him. I would say the Used is a lot less kind of commercial, as we see with the rise of My Chemical Romance or some of these other bands, Fall Out Boy, and how they evolved, maybe even out of the emo genre. Whereas the Used, still plays those kind of smaller venues and they put out consistent music, but their biggest albums are still some of those early albums. And I think some of it is because they're not quite as clean cut and put into boxes in the same way that maybe some of these other bands are, which we can kind of credit, whether that be good or bad, to Bert. All right. And then one other kind of, I guess, controversy or thing that we see that's popped up is the conversation around Bert's vocals. So there's a lot of controversy on whether or not he does all of his own vocals now, other members of the band taking over some of the screams that are iconic and definitely from Bert in the early years, them using tracks during some of their songs. And they get a lot of negative feedback about that. And even, feedback that maybe Bert's voice isn't what it used to be. Now, one thing to note is that Bert has gotten older and he has a higher register of his voice. So unfortunately, like most singers who tour a lot and sing at a high register, push their vocals to the limit, he has damaged his vocal cords over time. He's had surgeries and his voice has had to adapt because of that. And so he doesn't necessarily sing like he did before, but seeing them live, even on the cruise, 2 weeks ago, his voice sounded great. Yes, maybe there were, some tracks being used. Yes, other members of the band came through. They're not going to sound like they did early on. He's not going to push himself like that anymore. He probably has a lot more discipline over where he takes his voice in order to preserve it and keep touring and keep doing his job and the work that he does. Maybe his history with alcohol and drugs, maybe that impacted his voice. Like, who are we to say? We're not his doctors. But I don't think we can expect any band, any artist to sound like they used to, especially in this space where they're pushing themselves to the limit with with their sound, which it's not always about that. I think performance goes beyond the voice, the performance and the way that the band has fun on the stage and interacts with their audience, that I can definitely say is still there. Maybe he's not quite as much of a wild card that he was when he was younger. None of us would be as we get older, but he does still interact with the audience, create that shock, feed off of the energy of the crowd and give it back, which is everything that we could ask from artists and from bands that we see live. So also in 2024, Bert released a solo project. So not leaving the Used with support of the Used, but kind of leaning more into who he is, not as the frontman of the Used, but as Robbie, who his family refers to him as kind of more his true name. And the name is Robbie the Used. And the album is a little bit more pop than it is hardcore emo. And he says that in interviews that he's always wanted to infuse pop into the Used. That's what his influence has always been. His influence musically continues to be like some of the biggest pop artists of all time. And that is something he's really loved. But the band hasn't necessarily been as open to that. They've wanted to stay a little bit more hardcore. And so his solo project is a way to lean into that side. I listened to it after an interview of him introducing it, and he communicated how it was like a happier side of him, more about self-love. I would say happy is an interesting word. There's still definitely that rawness and kind of deep emotion that we see in the Used. There's still, pieces of that hurt and heartbreak that is included, but definitely a little different. So very interesting. And I recommend you check it out. I'd be curious what you guys think, especially if you love those early days of the Used. What do you think about the solo project? But with that, and even after watching so many interviews, fans have a lot of opinions on what they think about Bert. Some people will say he's creepy. They're not sure about him. They don't think that he's matured. But I think, just my personal opinion is that he's highly misunderstood. He's deeply creative. He's been through a lot in his life and hasn't necessarily always had security behind it. Maybe there's some immaturity there that I think a lot of people who go through trauma do experience in their life. But I think he's just a bit odd because of the things he's been through, because of the world that he's in, the position and the work that he does. It kind of feeds into an oddness that many of us who haven't been in that position could never understand. I appreciate how honest he is and how much he does open himself up to share. I think there's a beauty to that. Now, whether you believe everything he says, whether you would trust him, that's your decision. I don't think I'll ever have that option. I'm never going to be close to Bert McCracken. So that's not for me to even say, but I can appreciate who he has communicated himself to be as much as possible, and what I can take away from that, and how I can enjoy the lyrics, the music that have come out of, who he has become and who he is in his life, because I would not give up the music. I love it. I connect to it, and it means something different to me than maybe it meant to him. And you can maybe think differently if you would like, because you are entitled to that opinion. So where is the Used going next? They're still on tour doing their 3 different albums. The Robbie the Used side project, Bert is touring with that. There is no even sign that they are going to stop anytime soon. As they said, they've been doing it. They're still doing it. They're 25 years in. They're going to keep going. Will we see them? I know we're going to see them at, future festivals. I believe they're doing When We Were Young again, for those who are going out for that festival. But there's a big gap this year. Are we going to see them in more shows? Are they going to stick, in Australia and Europe for a while, as are some of the shows in the coming months? Are they going to come back to the US? Will we see another new album? Will we see a proper tour for the newer albums and getting to see those shows play out a little bit more? There's so much that we can maybe anticipate and expect from them in the future. And I personally am excited, especially with a new found appreciation of their art, diving into new music because of the Emo's Not Dead cruise and getting to see them live there. I'm excited for what else they will show. I'm excited for the influence of pop. I think I never would want them to lose their true, deep sound, but I do think that there is so much that we can discover, and I am here for it. Thank you again for tuning in to today's episode. Next week, we will try as hard as possible to define what emo actually is, which seems like an impossible task, but we are going to dive into it. We are probably going to step on some toes, and it's going to be a fun time. So come back, please. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. Give us a review if you want. Help me be seen for our little emo family, and I'll see you in the next class.